The house, the savings, the life insurance policy worth $400,000. My daughter-in-law smiled as she folded the documents into her purse and walked out of the attorney's office without looking back at me once. I stood there holding the only thing my son Marcus had left me in his will, a battered leather tool belt, 30 years old if it was a day, the brass buckle gone green, the loops cracked and stiff. The same tool belt I had given him the summer he turned 17, the summer we rebuilt the back porch together, just the two of us, working from sunrise until our hands were too sore to grip another nail. The attorney, a thin man named Gerald who kept clearing his throat, explained that Marcus had been very specific in his final instructions. His wife, Renata, would receive the house in Asheville, the savings accounts, the retirement fund, and the life insurance payout. His brother, my oldest son, Derek, would receive the truck and the woodworking equipment in the garage. And I, Raymond, his father, 64 years old and still not quite believing any of this was real, would receive the tool belt. Derek caught up with me in the parking lot. He put his hand on my shoulder and I could feel him searching for something to say. There was nothing to say. We both knew Marcus had been a deliberate man. Every decision he made had a reason behind it. He had been that way since he was a boy. Slow to speak, but always meaning exactly what he said. Maybe it's just sentimental, Derek offered. I nodded because I didn't want to cry in a parking lot in downtown Asheville. Marcus had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer 14 months before he passed. He had lived longer than the doctors predicted, which was exactly the kind of thing Marcus would do outlast the estimate. Refuse to go on anyone else's schedule. He had kept working right up until the last 3 months, finishing custom furniture orders from his workshop, sending pieces out to clients across the state. When the hospice nurses finally came, he was still sketching designs in a notebook propped against his knees. I had driven up from my home in Spartanburg every weekend those last months. Sometimes Renata would be there, sometimes not. She had married Marcus 7 years earlier, and I had tried for all 7 of those years to find common ground with her. She was not a warm woman. She was efficient, and she was smart, and she handled the household finances with a precision that Marcus admired. But there was a coldness to her that I could never quite get past. When I visited, she would make coffee, set it in front of me, and then disappear into another room. Marcus and I would sit at the kitchen table and talk the way we always had, slowly, circling around the things that mattered until we found our way to them. The last real conversation I remember was about 3 weeks before the end. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, the leaves outside his window already deep red and orange. He was tired that day, more than usual, and we sat quietly for a long stretch before he said, "Dad, do you still have that old compass I gave you?" I told him I did. A small brass compass he had found at an estate sale when he was in his 20s and pressed into my hand one Christmas, saying he figured I was the kind of man who needed to know which direction he was going at all times. He smiled at that. Then he said, "Good. Keep it close." I thought he was being sentimental. I thought he was thinking about mortality, about the things we leave behind and what they mean. I thanked him and squeezed his hand and didn't ask what he meant, because sometimes with Marcus you just had to sit with what he gave you and let it settle. He passed on a Tuesday morning in November, quietly, the way he had done most things. For the weeks after the funeral, I moved through my days in a kind of gray fog. I cooked meals I didn't taste, watched television I couldn't follow, took long walks around my neighborhood in the November cold. The tool belt sat on my workbench in the garage, coiled like something sleeping. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up, and I couldn't bring myself to move it. It was Derek who finally said what I had been turning over in the back of my mind. He called me on a Thursday evening, about 5 weeks after the funeral, and after a few minutes of ordinary conversation, he said, "Dad, Marcus left you that tool belt for a reason. You know that." I did know it. I had known it from the moment Gerald the attorney read it aloud. I just hadn't been ready to look. The next morning I went out to the garage before the sun was fully up. I uncoiled the tool belt on my workbench under the fluorescent light and went through it the way you'd go through the pockets of an old coat carefully, expecting nothing, half hoping for everything. The main pouch held what you'd expect. A measuring tape, worn smooth on the case. A flat carpenter's pencil, stub short, the wood splintered at the end. A small level, the bubble centered. I set each piece down gently, the way you handle things that belong to someone you loved. In the second pouch I found a folded square of yellow legal paper. My hands were not steady when I opened it. Marcus's handwriting, block letters. Precise, the way he always wrote. The way I used to tell him looked like the lettering on a blueprint. There were 4 lines. Dad, the compass points true. Start where you taught me the most important thing. Count 12 steps from the oak toward the water. The rest is waiting for you. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on my shop stool and read it again. Start where you taught me the most important thing. I knew immediately where he meant. 31 years ago, when Marcus was 11, we spent a long weekend at my brother Carl's property outside Brevard, 40 acres of Western Carolina mountain land, a creek running through the lower pasture, a pond at the far edge of the tree line. That was the weekend I had taught Marcus to use a level, a square, and a tape measure properly. The weekend we repaired Carl's collapsed dock together. I had told him that day, and I still remembered the exact words because they were the words my own father had said to me, that a man who could measure accurately and build a thing straight and true would never be without dignity, no matter what else the world took from him. He had never forgotten. He had mentioned that weekend more than once over the years, always in the context of something he was building, something he was trying to get right. Carl still owned the property. He was 71 now, and his knees were bad, but he still drove out there every few weeks to check on the place. I called him that same morning, before I'd even had breakfast, and asked if I could come out. "Marcus?" Carl asked, though I'd said nothing about the note. "Something he left me," I said. "Come whenever you want," Carl told me. "You know where the key is." It was a 2-hour drive from Spartanburg, mostly on I-26 before the turn onto the 2-lane roads that wound up into Transylvania County. I drove with the radio off and the windows cracked, even though it was cold, the way I used to drive when I needed to think. The mountains were bare now, gray-limbed and stark against a white November sky, beautiful in the way that things stripped down to their essential form are always beautiful. Carl's gate was unlocked. I followed the gravel track through the trees, past the winter-brown pasture, down toward the pond. The old dock had been replaced twice since Marcus and I repaired it. Carl built a better one 20 years ago, and then another after a hard winter took out 2 of the supports, but the oak was still there. The same white oak that had been growing at the edge of the pond bank for longer than any of us had been alive. Massive, gray-barked, its lower limbs reaching out over the water like arms. I stood at the base of the trunk with the compass in my palm and Marcus's note in my pocket, and I let myself feel the full weight of standing there without him. It took a few minutes. The pond was still and the air smelled like cold leaves and mud, and I let myself cry for a while, which I hadn't really done. Not properly, since the funeral. Then I set the compass level, took my bearing toward the water, and counted. 12 steps, heel to toe, the way you measure when you don't have a tape. The ground there was soft from the recent rains. I had brought a short spade from the truck, and I pressed the blade in gently, not wanting to force it. 2 inches down, the blade hit something solid, not rock, not root, a thud with a particular density that I recognized as wood. It took me about 20 minutes to clear the dirt from around it. A small wooden box, maybe 12 inches by 8, sealed with a strip of weatherproof caulk around the lid. Walnut, I could see when I wiped the mud away, hand-cut dovetail joints at the corners. Marcus's work, no question. I would have known his joinery anywhere. I carried it to the dock and sat with it in my lap for a moment before I opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 things. The first was an envelope with my name on it, Raymond, in Marcus's block lettering. The second was a smaller envelope, sealed, with an attorney's name and address stamped on the outside. Not Gerald, the attorney who had handled the will. A different name, a firm in Brevard. The third was a USB drive in a small Ziploc bag, labeled in blue marker. For Dad, open on any computer. I opened my envelope first. There on the dock, with the winter pond in front of me and the cold coming up off the water. It was 4 pages, handwritten, dated 9 months before Marcus died. He had written it in late February, early in the days after his diagnosis, when he could still sit at his workshop table for hours at a time. I will not write out every word of it because some things between a father and a son belong only to them. But I will tell you what he said, because you need to understand what my son was. He told me he had known about Renata's affair for almost 2 years before the diagnosis, a man named Stanton, a general contractor she had met through a mutual friend. Marcus had found out the way people usually find out, not by looking, but because the truth has a way of surfacing when it is ready, A mutual friend who assumed he already knew, an overheard phone call that resolved an inconsistency he hadn't consciously been tracking. He told me he had not confronted her. He had thought about it for a long time and decided that confrontation wasn't the point. He had already begun, quietly and carefully, separating his assets. His most significant asset, the one that Renata didn't know about, the one he had never disclosed because it predated their marriage, and he had deliberately kept it in his name alone, was a piece of property outside Brevard. 16 acres adjoining Carl's land on the eastern edge, with a small cabin on it, purchased 22 years ago when Marcus was in his 20s and land was cheap, and he had the foresight to put money into ground rather than things. Over the years, the land had appreciated considerably. A timber company had approached him about purchasing the mineral rights. He had declined, but the inquiry had led to an appraisal. The 16 acres and the cabin were worth, at current market, just over $800,000. He had transferred the property, through the Brevard attorney whose envelope I was now holding, into a trust with a single named beneficiary, me. He had also placed into the trust 7 years of monthly savings deposits in small enough amounts and into an account with no marital connection that they had never appeared in any financial disclosure Renata might have scrutinized. The total, when I eventually met with the Brevard attorney, was just under $90,000. He had not told me any of this while he was alive because he was afraid that I would say something not out of malice, he wrote, but because I was not a man built for secrets and Renata was very observant. He needed her to believe right up until the will was read that there was nothing she hadn't accounted for. He needed her to walk out of that attorney's office satisfied, so that she would not think to look further. He was writing me this letter, he said, because he needed me to find it after he was gone. Not immediately, he needed enough time to pass that Renata would have moved on, confident in what she'd received. The tool belt was the signal. The compass was the key. The note would lead me here. "I'm sorry you had to carry those weeks not knowing, Dad," he wrote near the end. "I know it wasn't fair to you, but I needed you to look genuinely grieved at the will reading, and I knew you would be, because you always wore your heart where anyone could see it. That was never a weakness. It was just who you were, and it was one of the things about you I most wanted to be." I sat on that dock for a long time. The light changed, the shadows from the bare oaks lengthening across the water, the temperature dropping as the afternoon wore on. A pair of Canada geese came in low over the pond and landed without fuss, barely a ripple. I watched them, and I thought about my son, who had been sick and frightened and betrayed, and who had spent the last months of his life not in bitterness, but in careful, loving problem-solving, who had thought about his father and said, in the only language he knew best, the language of measuring and building and getting things straight and true, "I'm going to take care of you." Derek drove up from Asheville when I called him. He sat next to me on the dock, and I let him read the letter, and when he was done, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's Marcus." "Yeah," I said. "Every bit of it." "Yeah." We laughed a little, which felt right. Marcus would have appreciated the precision of the thing. He would have been pleased that it had worked. The Brevard attorney's name was Patricia Hensley, and she had been holding the documents in escrow, exactly as Marcus had instructed, to be released upon my presentation of the walnut box and its contents. She was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of brisk efficiency that told you she had been doing this for 30 years and had seen everything. When I sat across her desk and laid out what Marcus had sent me, she looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. "He described you very accurately," she said. "He was observant," I said. "He said you'd have been crying," she said. "Not unkindly." "I had been," I said. She nodded and opened her filing drawer. The paperwork took 2 visits and several weeks to process fully. Marcus had been thorough, as he was with everything, every document properly executed, every transfer correctly recorded, nothing ambiguous, nothing that could be challenged. Patricia told me, more than once, that in 30 years of estate law she had rarely seen a layperson construct something this clean. "He had a good mind for structure," I told her. "He clearly did," she said. "I want to be honest with you about Renata, because I have thought about her a great deal in the months since all of this came to light. I am not a man who celebrates another person's humiliation, even when that person caused harm. What I know is this. Marcus made sure she received what she was legally entitled to the house, the accounts they held jointly, the insurance policy. He did not try to cheat her. He simply protected what had always been separate, what had been built before she entered his life, and what he had chosen deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was doing not to include her in. She does not know about the trust or the Brevard property. She does not need to. A few people in Marcus's circle suspected something when they heard I had inherited a tool belt, but suspicion is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as being able to do anything about it. The cabin outside Brevard needed work. Marcus hadn't used it in several years. The roof had soft spots. The porch railing had rotted at the posts. The interior needed paint and new floors in the 2 smaller rooms. I started going up on weekends last spring, working alone at first, then with Derek when he could make the drive. It took most of the summer to get it into good shape. There is a particular afternoon I keep coming back to. Late July, the air thick with heat and the smell of sawdust and pine resin. Derek and I fitting the last section of porch railing while a thunderstorm built itself slowly over the ridgeline to the west. We were using a level to check our posts, a newer level, not the one from Marcus's tool belt, which I had put back in the main pouch and hung on a nail inside the cabin door where I could see it. I don't know what Derek was thinking. I was thinking about a Sunday afternoon 31 years ago, a different dock, a younger version of my hands holding a different level, and a boy with sawdust in his hair watching with great seriousness to make sure the bubble was centered. A man who can measure accurately and build a thing straight and true will never be without dignity. Marcus built something straight and true in those last months of his life, quiet and private and invisible to everyone who wasn't meant to see it. He measured carefully, he accounted for every variable, and when the time came, it held exactly as he had intended. I keep the compass in the front pocket of my work jacket now, the way I kept it before. I check it sometimes without thinking, not because I'm lost, but because it was his, and because I like to know which direction I'm facing. If you've ever received something that seemed small and turned out to carry everything, I'd like to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below. And before you go, there's a story about a man who found 30 years of his father's secrets hidden inside an old clock. It's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever come across. Don't miss it. I'll see you there.